They say God is good all the time, but what if the evidence printed across our world and even across the pages of his own books tells a completely different and much darker story? This is the question that can make a room fall silent. It's a thought so heavy it feels like a physical weight. From a young age, many of us are taught that God is the ultimate source of love, a perfect father figure watching over us. To even think of him as anything else feels like a betrayal, a dangerous step into the dark. It creates a kind of mental friction, a battle in your own head between what you've been told to believe and what you can see with your two eyes. Today, we are going to walk right into that friction. We are going to confront the oldest paradox in theology, the problem of evil. We will look at the mountains of evidence that lead people to question God's goodness. We will read the disturbing stories from the texts themselves, and we will analyze why the typical Sunday school answers just don't hold up for so many. By the end, you'll understand why the idea of an evil or indifferent God isn't just an edgy thought, but a serious philosophical position born from centuries of human suffering. Let's begin by building our foundation. The version of God central to many major world religions, particularly Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, is defined by three key attributes. First, omnipotence. God is all-powerful. He can do anything that is logically possible. He can move mountains, create universes, and intervene in human affairs at will. Second, omniscience. God is all-knowing. He knows the past, present, and future. There are no secrets from him. He knows every choice you will ever make before you even think of it. And third, omnibenevolence. God is all good. He is perfectly moral, infinitely loving, and desires the best for his creation. This is the tri-omni-God, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good. Now, let's introduce a fourth, undeniable fact. Evil exists, not just as a concept, but as a real, tangible force in the world. This is what philosophers call the problem of evil, first famously formulated by the Greek philosopher Epicurus. The logic is brutally simple. If God is all good, he would have the desire to eliminate evil. If God is all-powerful, he would have the ability to eliminate evil. And if he's all-knowing, he's certainly aware of all the evil. Yet evil and suffering persist. This isn't just a minor issue, it's a direct logical contradiction. The four facts cannot all be true at the same time. One of them has to be wrong. And since we know for a fact that evil exists, the problem must lie with God's supposed attributes. Either he is not all-powerful, not all-knowing, or not all-good. Let's dissect the evidence for this, starting with what's called natural evil. This is the suffering that has nothing to do with human choices. This is the universe itself being hostile to life. Consider the Great Lisbon earthquake of 1755. On All Saints' Day, one of the holiest days of the year, a massive earthquake struck the city. Churches filled with worshippers were the first buildings to collapse, crushing thousands. Those who ran to the open space of the harbor were then drowned by a giant tsunami. And those who survived that were killed in the fires that raged for days. This event so shocked Europe that it single-handedly kicked off a huge philosophical debate. Thinkers like Voltaire couldn't reconcile this random, horrific slaughter with the idea of a loving God. This wasn't a one-time event, it's the blueprint of our planet. Mount Vesuvius erupting and burying Pompeii in ash, the Black Death wiping out as much as half of Europe's population, Hurricane Katrina destroying New Orleans. These events are not punishments for sin, they are indiscriminate. They kill saints and sinners, babies and the elderly, the kind and the cruel, all alike. And it gets more personal and even more cruel. Let's talk about diseases. Not just a cold, but truly horrific things. Imagine a parasitic wasp that lays its eggs inside a living caterpillar. The larvae then eat the caterpillar from the inside out, carefully avoiding the vital organs to keep it alive for as long as possible before they burst out of its body. Charles Darwin himself, a man who once studied to be a clergyman, wrote that he could not persuade himself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created the parasitic wasps with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars. This is the world God supposedly designed. A world where an innocent child can be born with Tay-Sachs disease, a genetic disorder where they slowly lose all their motor skills and senses, going blind, deaf, and becoming paralyzed before dying in agony before their 5th birthday. What possible higher purpose does this serve? To suggest that this is part of a mysterious plan feels like an empty and heartless platitude in the face of such raw, pointless agony. Then we have the vast tapestry of moral evil, the evil that we humans inflict upon one another. The standard defense here is always free will. God wanted us to be able to choose to love Him, and for that choice to be real, the option to choose evil had to exist. But let's really pressure test this idea. Is the free will of a handful of individuals worth the suffering of millions? Think of the transatlantic slave trade. For centuries, millions of Africans were captured, branded, packed into ships like cargo, and subjected to unimaginable cruelty. Families were torn apart, cultures were destroyed, and people were treated as less than human. Is the free will of the slave traders truly a good that outweighs that colossal evil? If a good God exists, why not simply intervene? Why not cause the slave ships to sink, or the captors to have a sudden change of heart? An all-powerful being could do this with no effort. Look at the genocides of the 20th century. The Holocaust is the most cited example, where the Nazis' free will led to the systematic murder of 6 million Jews. But there was also the Holodomor in the Soviet Union, where millions of Ukrainians were deliberately starved to death. There were the killing fields in Cambodia, where Pol Pot's regime murdered nearly a quarter of the country's population. There was the Rwandan genocide, where in just 90 days, nearly 1 million people were slaughtered, mostly with machetes. In the face of such absolute horror, the free will defense seems like a cruel joke. It prioritizes the abstract freedom of the murderer over the concrete life of the victim. We wouldn't accept this logic from a human authority. If a governor knew a murder was about to happen and did nothing, saying he didn't want to interfere with the killer's free will, we would call him an accessory to the crime. Furthermore, the very concept of free will clashes with God's omniscience. If God knows with 100% certainty what you are going to do tomorrow, how can your choice be truly free? If you knew before creating a person that they would go on to become a monstrous dictator and kill millions, and He created them anyway, isn't He partially responsible for their actions? He knowingly brought that evil into the world. This brings us to the most direct evidence of all, the character of God as described in His own supposed holy book, the Bible. If we read the Old Testament without the lens of faith, what we find is not a loving father, but a figure who often appears to be a cruel, jealous, and bloodthirsty warlord. We've all heard the story of Noah's Ark. God saw wickedness and decided on a global flood. This wasn't a targeted strike against the wicked. It was the drowning of the entire planet. Every man, woman, and child, every baby in its mother's arms, every land animal from the elephant to the ant. This is an act of total, indiscriminate annihilation. If any other figure in any other mythology did this, we would call them the villain of the story. Then there is God's direct command for genocide. After the Israelites escape from Egypt, God orders them to conquer the land of Canaan. His instructions in Deuteronomy 7 are chillingly specific. You must destroy them totally, make no treaty with them, and show them no mercy. And in 1 Samuel 15, God commands King Saul to attack the Amalekites. Now, go, attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them, put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. The command is explicit: kill the babies. How can a being who is the source of all morality command the murder of infants? The stories of God's petty cruelty are numerous. In 2 Kings, the prophet Elisha is walking along when some young boys come out and make fun of him for being bald. Elisha responds by cursing them in the name of the Lord. Then, 2 bears come out of the woods and maul 42 of the boys. Is the appropriate divine response to childhood teasing a gruesome, fatal bear attack? In another story, a man named Uzzah reaches out his hand to steady the Ark of the Covenant when the oxen stumble. It was an instinctual, helpful act. God's response? He strikes Uzzah dead on the spot for touching the holy object. This isn't justice, it's the action of a hypersensitive tyrant with a fragile ego. And of course, there's the story of Job, which reads like a blueprint for divine cruelty. God brags to Satan about how righteous Job is. Satan suggests Job is only good because his life is easy. So God enters into a bet with Satan and gives him permission to destroy Job's life to test his loyalty. Job's 10 children are killed when a house collapses on them. All his wealth is destroyed. He's covered in painful sores. Job suffers terribly, all for a cosmic wager. It is a story of a powerful being torturing an innocent man just to prove a point.
So how do theologians try to solve this? They've developed explanations called theodicies. One of the oldest is the Augustinian theodicy. It argues that evil isn't a thing in itself, but rather a privation of good, like darkness is just the absence of light. It says that God created a perfect world, but evil entered through the free will of angels and humans, the fall, who turned away from God. But this feels like a philosophical word game. A child's cancer is not an absence of health in a philosophical sense. It is a very real, very present, and very painful tumor. And blaming all human suffering on the choice of two people in a mythical garden thousands of years ago seems like a massive case of collective punishment, which is itself unjust. A more modern defense is the Irenaean or soul-making theodicy. This view, popularized by philosopher John Hick, argues that God intentionally created a world with challenges, dangers, and suffering, not as a punishment, but as an environment where we can grow morally and spiritually. The world is a gym for the soul where we build virtues like courage, compassion, and perseverance. This sounds appealing, but it falls apart when you look at the sheer scale and type of suffering. Is the unimaginable pain of being burned alive necessary for soul-making? Does the agony of a fawn trapped in a forest fire build its character? Much of the suffering in the world doesn't build character, it shatters people. It leaves them broken, traumatized, and bitter. The amount of evil seems far in excess of what would be needed for any soul-making program. So the defenses seem to crumble under scrutiny. The free will argument doesn't cover natural evil and makes God seem complicit. The soul-making argument can't justify the extreme and pointless suffering we see. This is where we reach the climax of our investigation. We've been operating under the assumption that God must be good and that evil is the problem we have to explain. But what if we flip the entire script? What if God's goodness is the assumption we have wrong? What if we start with the evidence of a brutal natural world, of horrific human cruelty, and of a divine character in Scripture who is often violent and vengeful? If we look at all this evidence objectively, the idea that the being in charge is perfectly good seems like the most far-fetched explanation. What are the alternatives? This brings us to dystheism, the belief that God is not good, or maltheism, the belief that God is actively malevolent. Maybe God is like a clumsy engineer who created a flawed, broken universe and doesn't know how to fix it. Or maybe he is a being that isn't all-powerful, a good deity fighting against a dark force he can't fully defeat. This is the dualism seen in some ancient religions. Or perhaps it's deism, the idea of the divine clockmaker. God created the universe with all its physical laws, wound it up, and then just let it go. He is not involved, not listening to prayers, not intervening. He is utterly indifferent. This would explain the silence from the heavens during the Holocaust and the random cruelty of tsunamis. There's no malice, but there's also no love. There is only cold, impartial, cosmic law. Or we arrive at the most chilling possibility, the one that aligns frighteningly well with many of the Old Testament stories, that God is, in fact, a malevolent being. A being that enjoys power, demands worship, and lashes out with terrifying violence when he doesn't get his way. From this perspective, the world isn't a test of our faith in a good God. It's a playground for a cosmic tyrant. This is a horrifying idea, but it resolves the problem of evil perfectly. The reason a world full of evil exists is because the being in charge of it is himself evil.
In the end, we've traveled to the very edge of theological comfort. We've seen how the existence of profound suffering presents a logical paradox for a tri-omni God. We've seen how the traditional explanations for this suffering often feel hollow and inadequate. We've looked into the sacred texts and found a divine character full of wrath and vengeance. The question, is God evil, is not born from a desire to be shocking. It is born from an honest and painful observation of the world. It's the result of taking suffering seriously. It's the acknowledgement that if there is a God, His actions or his inactions require a much more difficult and disturbing explanation than "he is good."